What happens when country music's biggest star walks into what he thinks is a friendly morning show interview, only to find himself facing the kind of grilling usually reserved for politicians? Blake Shelton thought he was stopping by Good Morning America to talk about his latest tour and maybe crack a few jokes with the hosts. Instead, he found himself in a verbal sparring match that would end with security escorting him off the set. If you want to see how a simple interview can explode into television chaos, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story is about to get wild. The morning began like any other at the Good Morning America studios in Times Square. Blake arrived wearing his signature cowboy hat, relaxed and smiling, fully expecting the usual easy conversation about music, touring, and life after leaving The Voice. He had done interviews like this hundreds of times, and they all followed the same comfortable rhythm. Friendly banter, a few laughs, a plug for the tour, then home. George Stephanopoulos welcomed him warmly, the cameras rolling live to millions of viewers. Blake responded with his trademark grin, clearly at ease. But that ease vanished almost instantly when George shifted the tone. Instead of music or touring, George brought up Blake's recent comments about the state of country music, specifically his criticism of younger artists, and the claim that some fans viewed his remarks as elitist and out of touch. Blake hesitated. This wasn't what he expected. He tried to clarify, explaining that country music has always evolved and that he had supported new artists throughout his career. But George pressed harder, replaying quotes and suggesting Blake had dismissed modern artists as lacking authenticity. The studio atmosphere changed almost immediately. The light, casual mood evaporated, replaced by tension thick enough to feel. When George framed the issue around gender and race, Blake's composure cracked. He firmly denied ever making comments about identity, insisting his critique was about musical style, not people. George leaned in, challenging him again, implying Blake's definition of real country conveniently excluded artists who didn't fit the traditional mold. By now, Blake's frustration was visible. His jaw tightened, his voice sharpened. He accused George of twisting his words and pushing a narrative. Around them, crew members exchanged uneasy glances. This was no longer a morning show interview. It was becoming a confrontation, and everyone in the studio could feel it building towards something explosive. George maintained his calm, journalistic tone, insisting he was only asking for clarification. Blake pushed back, explaining that when he talked about country music's roots, he meant storytelling, real-life experiences, and emotional honesty. He argued that chasing trends and streaming numbers sometimes diluted what made the genre special. But George wasn't satisfied. He questioned whether Blake himself still represented those roots, pointing out his wealth, arena tours, and luxury lifestyle. The implication hit hard. Blake bristled, reminding George that he grew up poor in Oklahoma, worked construction jobs, and played dive bars long before fame found him. Nothing, he insisted, had been handed to him. George countered by asking whether someone living in mansions and flying private jets could truly speak for working-class values. That question snapped something in Blake. He shot back that success shouldn't disqualify someone from authenticity, and accused George of punishing him for achieving the American dream. The conversation spiraled. Blake stood up abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, accusing George of running an ambush interview. The studio audience fell silent. George asked him to sit down and continue professionally. Blake refused, saying he was being railroaded and misrepresented on live television. As voices rose, production staff began whispering urgently through headsets. Cameras kept rolling. George defended his line of questioning as accountability journalism. Blake called it a hit job. The word hung heavy in the air. George pressed on, suggesting Blake was used to softball interviews and couldn't handle real scrutiny. Blake fired back that integrity shouldn't require defending himself against false implications. The exchange had shifted from tense to openly hostile. When George accused Blake of deflecting, Blake accused George of advocacy disguised as journalism. The audience sat frozen, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Blake declared he wouldn't participate in his own character assassination. George challenged him to clarify his stance, but Blake said the environment was already poisoned. No matter what he said, he believed it would be twisted. The trust was gone, and without trust, The interview was over in his mind. By this point, security personnel had quietly moved closer, anticipating what might come next. George's patience finally cracked. He raised his voice, emphasizing that with a platform reaching millions, Blake's words carried real consequences. Blake snapped back that he never dismissed anyone and never turned music into a political issue. George did. The argument escalated rapidly. Blake accused the media of turning every opinion into a controversy for ratings. George denied it, insisting the questions were legitimate. Blake countered that they were designed to trap him regardless of how he answered. As the two men talked over each other, the studio descended into controlled chaos. Producers debated cutting away but hesitated, knowing they were broadcasting a moment that would dominate headlines. Audience members discreetly pulled out phones, recording history in real time. George accused Blake of running away from discomfort. Blake stopped mid-stride and spun back around, furious. He said discomfort was one thing, but being portrayed as a racist elitist was another. He accused George of using implication instead of accusation to shape public perception. George denied labeling him, but Blake argued the damage was done through suggestion alone. The exchange turned deeply personal. Blake said he had spent 20 years building his reputation, only to see it threatened in minutes by biased questioning. When George suggested Blake should be more careful with his words, Blake exploded. He rejected the idea of sanitizing his opinions to avoid outrage. He accused the media of hunting for the worst possible interpretation of everything. At that point, George snapped back that if Blake couldn't handle tough questions, maybe he shouldn't make public statements. The comment stunned Blake. He accused George of believing he had the authority to decide who could speak freely. The shouting was now undeniable. The professionalism of the set had collapsed. Everyone watching knew this interview was beyond recovery. Blake turned toward the exit again, his decision final. George called after him, accusing him of running from accountability. Blake spun back one last time, his anger barely contained. He said this wasn't accountability, it was a setup, a calculated attempt to destroy his character on live television. George challenged him to stay and fight for his reputation instead of storming off. That was the breaking point. Blake marched back toward the desk, pointing his finger and delivering the line that froze the room. He accused George of being a failed political operative taking frustrations out on country music. The insult landed hard. George fired back that at least he asked real questions instead of pandering. Blake scoffed, saying these weren't hard questions, they were dishonest ones. Security finally stepped in, positioning themselves just off camera as Blake moved away again. The producers made the call to cut to commercial, but not before viewers saw Blake being escorted off the set. The fallout was immediate. Social media erupted within minutes. Clips spread like wildfire. Some viewers praised George for holding a powerful figure accountable. Others accused the show of ambushing a guest in bad faith. Blake's fans rallied behind him, while critics dissected every word of the exchange. By the end of the day, the interview was already being called one of the most explosive moments in morning television history. What was meant to be a simple tour promotion had turned into a cultural flashpoint about media, authenticity, and who gets to define the roots of country music. And long after the cameras stopped rolling, one thing was certain. Nobody who watched that morning would forget what happened when Blake Shelton walked into Good Morning America expecting a conversation and walked out in chaos.